Well, hello, workers and peasants and students. Here we are in the midst of this terrible crisis of the coronavirus, everything associated with that. We're going to go take a look at this problem of the dictatorship of the proletariat in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, and the whole question of the transition from the Lenin regime, with which we start out the whole story in 1917, up to the regime of Stalin. A story that I think is well worth our taking into consideration, and pondering as we go through the course. Well worth thinking about. But before I get started with that, let me preface all this by saying that I think that we will have a difficult time with this coronavirus and with all of the restrictions imposed on us and all the rest of that. And I'm hoping you're all holding up under it. And, I don't know how well I'm holding up under it, but we're all, we're all facing, something fairly severe, fairly difficult. And I would say, much more stringent. The home front in World War II couldn't have been as stringent as this. We're all confined to our household. So that if you have thoughts about this, let me know. And perhaps we can discuss it more and more as we go through the semester, especially at these kind of meetings, if they come off. So this is the first one that we're going to have, and it has to do with the succession struggle. So let's think about that. Let's ignore the problems that are surrounding us right now and get our minds off it by thinking about the Russian Revolution. So we have to deal with this problem that is indicated on the outline with the title Stalin's Apparat Conquers the Dictatorship of the Proletariat, 1921 to 1927. It begins with the whole story of Lenin and Stalin. So you already have a kind of an interpretation of it that is usually given by most of the textbook literature on this topic. Most of the historians look at Russia as a case, along with other countries, with a social experiment, with a domestic problem, and etc. They tend to look at the Russian Revolution that way. So we were talking about workers, peasants, leadership of the country, and those related things. Most of them do not take into consideration the world setting, the international setting. And the international setting is rather important. It's on account of the international setting that this regime has ended up with this revolution. It's on account of World War I and this international setting. So we've already paid attention to that idea. We should continue, it seems to me, to pay attention to this idea as we proceed through our discussion of problems like the succession struggle, such as we're talking about today. So I want to continue to have this thing in mind, the international setting. I'll be interested in the greatest powers and how they deal with Russia, and especially Britain. Remember that Britain is probably still the greatest power, the leading power in world affairs and world politics during this period. It's hard for us to imagine now when we think of the condition that Britain is in now as a great power. She's not really a great power, strictly speaking, by comparison to the United States. You have to use your mind's eye and imagine Britain at the top of things during the 1920s, and imagine the United States as a power that's only coming on, that has not really reached the point of, in effect, being the hegemonic military power in the world, such as it is today. So I think if we use that context, it may help us to understand things. The first thing we have to deal with is the whole problem of Lenin versus Stalin. Why don't I introduce that by showing this picture of a demonstration that took place in Moscow, and there's a present-day leader, or a present-day militant, of the Russian Communist Party behind a statue of Karl Marx with pictures of Lenin and Stalin. And for these communist militants today in the Communist Party, such as it exists in Russia, they still take the view that the natural successor of Lenin was Stalin, that is, the great leadership of Stalin should never have been doubted by the Russian people. They made a big mistake under Gorbachev when the regime fell apart to doubt Stalin, and the regime really fell apart because of the criticism of Stalin, they would probably say. And that's not so much different. That's not too much different from the perspective that you might see in Western literature too. And here's a Soviet depiction of the idea, one among many that could have been chosen, where Stalin is seen as Lenin's pupil, the most faithful servitor of the cause of Lenin and the great leader in the Leninist tradition. Curiously, that's more or less the way the outside literature, the literature of the Cold War especially, that's more or less the way they looked at the problem of Lenin and Stalin. They see them essentially as two. It's a normal and natural thing. These are people in the West, and we are more or less among them, people who are afraid of the Russian Revolution or may even be hostile to the Russian Revolution, are afraid of its social experiment, everything associated with that. And there's a tendency to look at the dictatorship as it developed in the 1930s under Stalin and say it had to come from Lenin. It had to be a natural result of the Russian Revolution. In fact, I mean, the most extreme way of putting this question is to say that it had to be the natural result of trying to impose socialism on a country. So they're not looking at the World War, the international situation, or any of those other big factors that are really the main factors that cause the whole thing. They're not looking at any of those things. What they're trying to say is that this is a particular kind of social experiment that we can rank with other social experiments, and it had to go sour. And that the social experiment is a bad idea in the first place under Lenin, so it had to result in the dictatorship of Stalin, and really at its worst in the 1930s. There's another view of the matter, and that's mainly given by Trotsky, but more or less shared by many people who are not Trotskyists or who do not march under the banner of Trotsky. And the idea is that the Lenin regime was much different, that Lenin was rather closer to Trotsky as a revolutionary, although this is not to take away from Stalin the appellation of being a genuine revolutionary in the Lenin tradition. He certainly is. But that Lenin's scheme, Lenin's leadership is much closer to the leadership of Trotsky than it is to that of Lenin. Lenin was not an administrator. Lenin certainly would not have put many, many hundreds of thousands of people, who knows, maybe millions, into prison camps and all the rest of that, carry out terrible purges, ending up shooting the whole generation of Leninist revolutionaries, presumably, as Stalin ended up doing in the 1930s. So there's always been a view that there's a radical discontinuity between Lenin and Stalin, and there's no point talking about Lenin and Stalin being in a continuum. The continuity thesis, it is sometimes called by historians of my generation. So they are thinking mainly of the leadership of Lenin during the period when he was running the government under the Civil War, during the Civil War, and when Trotsky was running the armed forces at the front during the Civil War as War Commissar. That those two were very intimate colleagues, that Trotsky was not the assassin of the Russian Revolution, as Stalin later described him, but that really the intimacy between Lenin and Trotsky is much more prevalent and much more clear to everyone than the relationship between Lenin and Stalin. And here you see Lenin and Trotsky talking together about serious political military problems of the Civil War. Lev Kamenev on the right, going to be the associate of Grigory Zinoviev. He will be head of the Comintern. He will be an important leader in the party, Zinoviev, as you can see on your outline. Trotsky and Lenin are the ones, though, who are having the conversation in this photo. And you can see in Lenin's eye, I think, or at any rate, I can't help seeing it, this feeling that he can really talk to Trotsky, that he can really express the most profound, the most tricky, the most arcane kinds of thoughts that he might have about the revolution, about who's helping it and who's hindering it, and all the rest of that. And that he really sees in Trotsky a genuine, how to put it, comrade in arms, so to speak, in the Russian Revolution, and that he doesn't regard Trotsky as an interloper, a traitor, and all those other things that Stalin ended up saying that Trotsky was. So at any rate, that is the problem. If you look at this picture of the leaders on a medal struck in 1918, the first year anniversary of the first year of the revolution, or I should say the first anniversary of the revolution, you see a whole string of leaders of the party. You see Lenin in the middle, Trotsky to your immediate left, his right, right above Trotsky, Karl Radek, to the left, Sverdlov, Yakub Sverdlov, who died in 1918. Sverdlov would probably have been the figure who would have been in the position that Stalin was in had Stalin or had Sverdlov lived. But you don't see Stalin in this picture. You see Zinoviev, you see Madame Kolodai at the bottom. She's Minister of Culture, first woman member of a European cabinet. And you see all the other leaders of the revolution, but you don't see Stalin. He's not quite important enough to get into this picture of the top 10 or so leaders of the party. He's immediately after them, though, and very, very close to the leadership, very much part of the leadership, but I would say a subordinate part, an executive rather than a person who deliberates about policy. He's a person who gets things done, so to speak. Not a brilliant person when it comes to writing articles and books, certainly can't participate in the disputes in the same way that Lenin, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Buharin, Kamenev, Radek, a number of others can't write clever articles, can't solve a political problem, policy problem, all on his own. Very unlikely to present any original formulation about anything. No, that's not something you would expect of Stalin, but a very, very efficient and shrewd administrator, a person who knows how to apply pressure downward. That's something that Lenin admired. It wasn't the thing he admired most in politics, but it was something he did not hesitate to express his admiration for, this administrative side of the work, as Lenin would put it. That is to say, running an outfit, telling people what to do, getting things done, putting pressure on subordinates, that sort of thing. Sort of thing you hope for in military affairs, sort of thing we're looking for now, strictly speaking, in this crisis that we're facing, executive ability, the ability to organize things, get things done, and all the rest of that. So Stalin is second to none when it comes to those qualities of leadership. So that's the kind of person we have in Stalin. Let's not denigrate him the way Trotsky often did. Trotsky called him a mediocrity. Well, he's mediocre among the intellectuals who lead the party and who actually determine questions of policy, but not mediocre by any other standard of measure. Certainly not mediocre as an executive, quite a brilliant, strictly speaking, a brilliant executive. And then one other factor that we ought to take into consideration about Stalin, no one is afraid of him. No one is afraid of him. He's not an intellectual. He's not going to outwit you and all the rest of that. So in a certain sense, many of these leaders, say Trotsky might be among these people, but also maybe even Zinoviev, Buharin, Kamenev, Radek, all the others, maybe they underestimated Stalin in that way. None of them were afraid of him, and they didn't mind giving him all sorts of posts of considerable responsibility. And the reason for that is that they really felt that he wouldn't get out of line, would not be a challenge to any of the main leaders. It was not quite brilliant enough to represent a genuine challenge to them. And what does he represent in the hierarchy of the party? Well, you remember the discussion that Lenin had in 1902 about what sort of party he was going to put together. A vanguard party of the proletariat, presumably, and an illegal party inside Russia. Well, who's going to run this illegal apparatus in Russia? Turns out that most of the leaders of the party were in exile, and most of them were carrying out editorial duties of turning out the party paper, and that's really what determines policy. The paper is key. But who distributes the paper in Russia? Who does the illegal work? Who runs an apparatus? Who carries out bank robberies in order to gather funds for the party, who does all of those things inside the party under illegal conditions, and even in the likelihood of arrest and exile, in which Stalin faced. He actually was arrested and exiled on 2 occasions. He was in exile when the revolution happened in 1917, and the others were in the West. He was in Russian exile in Siberia. So the committee men, they called them, these illegal operators, these full-time Bolsheviks, these people would not have been very important if the Menshevik vision of the organization question had prevailed in 1902. If you'd had a Menshevik kind of party, this sort of person would not be very important in that party. But in Lenin's party, which requires an illegal apparatus, illegal, sort of semi-criminal, strictly speaking, apparatus, Stalin turned out to be the very best one, the very most powerful and most astute of these committee men. So there's an important thing about the structure of the Bolshevik Party that's going to put Stalin in a position where he's going to be very important. And then the other thing I said about him was that the leaders had no trepidations at all about giving Stalin important posts in the party. In 1922, they make him General Secretary of the party. They put him at the head of the Workers' and Peasants' Inspectorate at the same time. That's an agency that overlooks government employees. Workers' and Peasants' Inspectorate, the RABKRIN. And then the Party Control Commission, more or less the same thing as the RABKRIN, except not just for government employees, but for party members. So he is looking into party members. Oh, well, many people feel he's looking into excessive drunkenness, and inability to attend meetings on time, efficiency problems, things like that. But there's also a question of political disloyalty and other questions like that that come up when you think about the activities of the Party Control Commission. So look at these 3 posts that Stalin had right from the beginning, and everyone was agreed that he was the right man for this sort of thing. The Party Secretariat, the RABKRIN, and the Control Commission. It makes you ask the question, is this the kind of party that is going to be able to overcome the state if it comes into conflict with the state, or is the state going to win that battle? You wouldn't have said it putting Stalin in the role of the defender of the party in 1922. You would have put it in terms of Lenin and Trotsky. You would have said Lenin is the person who runs the party and not the state so much. Trotsky, you would have said, is the person who runs the state, the dictatorship of the proletariat. He's war commissar. Remember, they've just built an army from scratch, and it's pretty much Trotsky's work. They've just come through the Civil War, and that too is pretty much Trotsky's work. He's the outstanding political leader during the Civil War. He's practically a warlord, Trotsky is, by that time. So he represents the state. Which is it, the party or the state? You would have said Lenin and Trotsky in 1922. Later on, maybe you might think about the same things in terms of Trotsky and Stalin. Well, that's the setting for our problem of the Soviet succession in the 1920s. But let's consider the international setting of the thing, which most other studies don't really pay much attention to. Let's consider the fact that the Soviets have won the Civil War. They've defeated the Allied intervention. They've driven out the interventionists and crushed the whites. They're stacking arms, as you see in this Soviet poster from the period. They're stacking arms. They get ready to go back to peace, to the plow, to the industrial bench. Going to go back to their peacetime pursuits on the defeat of the enemy. And on the defeat of the enemy, the Entente, represented by this fellow in the top hat, the Entente, he's ready to start to play ball with the Soviets. He can't crush them, can't destroy them, so he's ready to start to come to terms with them. So in the name of capital, you see him restraining all of these military leaders of the whites, and the priests, and the Russian bourgeoisie, and the French, who are very reluctant to put their sword back into the sheath. You see him restraining all these other elements, and he's going to come to terms with the Soviets, and the Soviets too. And so they sign a treaty in 1921, the Anglo-Soviet Trade Pact. That's going to make it possible for the Soviets to build all sorts of equipment for sale in the West and buy a lot of equipment from the West. They're going to be buying locomotives, for example, for their Russian railways from the British, and naturally British businessmen are going to be delighted to do this business with Soviet Russia. The only problem is, are they dealing with the very force in the world that, well, it wants to destroy them? The answer to that is yes. Yes, these are the people who want to overthrow the capitalism. And Lenin says it frankly, you know, we think the capitalists will sell us the rope with which to hang them. So that is pretty straightforward on the part of Lenin. And I think the understanding, it kind of goes both ways. There's a feeling you can do business with Russia, even though you may not like it. And as long as Russia does not really make too many inroads in the British Empire, as long as it doesn't make possible some kind of Indian revolt that overthrows the British and drives the British out of India, or maybe drives them out of the Middle East. And of course, the Russians are interested in all these things. The Russian communists are interested in carrying out these very tasks. And they think they can do it under the aegis, under the rubric, under the cover, that'd be the right way to put it, under the cover of the Anglo-Russian Trade Treaty of 1921. So we'll watch this whole thing. That's the international setting for this thing, this uneasy relationship, this détente, you might call it, with the West. And we'll see that wearing thin, and by the end, it will be all over. And the West will decide it's got to crush Soviet Russia one way or another. Got to figure out a way to do it. And the Russians will start to realize, before I'm through, and I hope it's not before too long, the Russians will start to realize that it's necessary to muscle up, to collectivize agriculture, to go to forced industrialization under the 5-year plan and all the rest of that. So the shape of the regime will be determined, in my opinion, by this relationship they have with the West, and that relationship is determined by the Russian revolutionary activities to overthrow the British Empire. So that is a general theme that I think we have to have in mind, thinking about the innards of the problem. There you see a cartoon with a Russian diplomat approaching John Bull and making an appeal. Oh, we need some credits. Lenin put this rather sharply by saying, oh, we're going to try to overthrow you. We're going to do the best we can to overthrow you. But in the meantime, we're going to need your help. And we know you'll give this help, even though you understand that we want to overthrow you. You'll give us this help because you see some profit in it, and it's in your nature to make a deal with us. So more or less the attitude that Lenin describes very frankly and straightforwardly about the trade treaty. And so here's a cartoon from Punch, you know, giving an indication of the way the British understand this relationship with Soviet Russia. Inside Soviet Russia, the Minister of Finance, the first one, Grigory Sokolnikov, said that he thought the turn to NEP in 1921 was a rebirth of Lenin's idea of state capitalism, which was kicked around briefly in 1918. So Sokolnikov, in effect, started to try to redefine this whole thing in terms of the setting of this greater global relationship with Britain, this made possible by the Anglo-Soviet Trade Treaty. And in fact, the British are the ones, British think that Sokolnikov is probably the person closest to them when it comes to having actual business-like relationships with the Soviet leaders. So he's a rather important figure in that respect. He tried to redefine Lenin's idea of state capitalism by saying that the Russians ought to put their industry on a basis of khozrazchyot, Russian word which is on your outline. It means national self-sufficiency. You could say autarky, or more precisely, business paying its own way. That there ought not to be subsidies for business, that business ought to act as a capitalist enterprise in effect, pay its own way. And an extreme example of that, even important businesses should be allowed to go under if they're not efficient. They should be allowed to lay off workers and etc. the Soviet regime can more or less make it possible that make impossible the suffering of these workers, and can take care of their needs and be a sort of, how to put it, a supplement to the activities of Sokolnikov. So that was Sokolnikov's perspective on the matter, and designed to improve relations with Britain, to improve generally economic relations with the outside world. The way this struck Trotsky was that this was a terrible compromise that the regime was entering into with the outside world, and that it was dangerous in the extreme. So Trotsky took the view right from the beginning that it should not be a good idea to relinquish the monopoly of foreign trade, as Sokolnikov wanted to do. It wouldn't be a good idea to put industry on a pay-as-you-go basis, no. What would happen, for example, if the Soviet steel industry faded? Do you want the dictatorship of the proletariat to try to operate without a steel industry? No. So Trotsky was very much against that. Trotsky and Sokolnikov very much at swords points, not over political matters particularly, but over this matter of economics, and not really over economic policy generally, but over these questions that bear directly on foreign trade and on relations with the outside, and on the progress of the Anglo-Soviet trade relationship. What was Lenin's position on all of this? Well, Lenin's position was that what the Soviet regime really wanted was trade credits and recognition from the West. And the Soviet regime could probably get that through negotiation. Lloyd George, who you see in the forefront, the lower left, your lower left in this picture, with his hands on his hips, Lloyd George, for the British, takes the view that the Soviets are too close to Turkey, that the British want the Greeks to win in Turkey, that the British want to establish themselves at the Straits, that the Soviets are probably helping Turkey. So it might be a good idea to come to terms with the Soviet Union to separate them from Turkey. So Lloyd George, very shrewd fellow, thinking in terms of foreign policy questions, more than ideological questions, you could say here, has got himself into the position where he thinks maybe some kind of détente, some kind of decent relations with the Soviets might be in the British interest at this particular point. So the Soviets loved that idea, want to come to terms, wanted a general endorsement of trade credits and recognition, and wanted the British to impose it upon all the other nations, and wanted that to be the relationship they would have with the Western capitalist powers. And they thought they would get that at the Genoa conference, which met in the spring of 1922. There's a popular book on the Genoa conference by Carol Fink, European Diplomacy, The Origins of Détente, it has sometimes been called. And of course, Lloyd George is the key figure on the Genoa conference. Well, all those hopes tied up with the Genoa conference and Lenin's position that Sokolnikov was perfectly okay in order to get a relationship with the British and with the others at the Genoa conference. So Lenin saw this question between Zinoviev and between Sokolnikov and Trotsky. Lenin saw this thing as a tactical issue, and if we got the trade credits and the rest of it in the West, Lenin thought, we would be perfectly willing to put our industry on the basis of pay-as-you-go. We'd be perfectly willing to relinquish the monopoly of foreign trade and allow Russians to have bank accounts in the West and all the rest of that. We'd be willing to make all these concessions, plenty of concessions, and even call them state capitalism, as he had in 1918, if, that's the important thing, if the West were to yield and give these trade credits and recognition on part of all the powers. Now, that's not just the British, but it's also the French. And that turned out to be a losing proposition, because Lenin lost on this issue. The Genoa conference fizzled. The French especially went against Lloyd George's too sophisticated thoughts about the Soviets, The French were thinking about all the money they'd lost in Russia, how they wanted to get it back someday, and didn't see any particular advantage. And by the way, did not support the British on the whole question of Greece and Turkey, which was the whole reason that Lloyd George was trying to call this conference. So it was the antagonism between Lloyd George and Poincaré for the French that sunk the Genoa conference. And Lenin's position turned on a dime. And he started to advocate, immediately after that, the position of Trotsky. It's a mistake to allow the proletariat to put its industry on the basis of pay-as-you-go, khozrazchyot. It's a mistake, Lenin said. So he changes his position completely, stops supporting Sokolnikov, and goes over to Trotsky. And the last months of his life, he and Trotsky are like Siamese twins. They are very, very intimate and very close politically. But at the same time, Lenin suffered his first stroke in 1922. So the Lenin we're talking about, so I get these pictures up to snuff here. The Lenin we're talking about is a Lenin who has started to suffer a series of strokes. These will continue right up until 1924. He'll die in January 24 after the third of these very debilitating strokes, difficult strokes for him. Most difficult because he did not lose his powers to reason and even to operate politically, but he lost a lot of his physical strength. He lost the ability to write with his hands, to actually carry out cursive and all the rest of that stuff, do all those sorts of things. Found it hard to dictate, didn't speak well, etc. But his mind is still racing, and he dictates all sorts of very sharp articles. So he still had all his marbles, despite the obvious physical deterioration of a series of these nasty strokes, which killed him in January of 1924. During that period, the party put Stalin in care of Lenin's medical needs. So Stalin is supervising the doctors around Lenin. If you can imagine that, that's the confidence they all had in Stalin. Or maybe another way of putting it, that's the lack of fear that they had about Stalin, or maybe, let's put it more strongly, the underestimation with which they viewed Stalin. So they give him all these positions of importance, and this is really just one more in that regard. And during this period, we find that Lenin is coming up against Stalin, a whole string of issues. And they all have to do with Sokolnikov, at least at first, the monopoly of foreign trade. A number of other issues come up at the end of 1922. It's Lenin and Trotsky, and it's Stalin on the other side, but really not Stalin so much as Stalin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev. Let's see if I have some pictures of them. Stalin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev. So here you have Stalin on the extreme left, Zinoviev, head of the Comintern, head of the Leningrad party apparatus, Kamenev, second from the right, third from the left, gesturing toward you. Lev Kamenev, very close confrere of Zinoviev's. Kamenev, very shrewd character, but not very independent, not very courageous or anything like that, but a very shrewd fellow, and usually pretty much who tied his star for some reason or I should say tied his fate to Zinoviev's star. And he's talking with Alexei Rykov, and Rykov is going to have a position rather similar to that vis-a-vis Buharin, who we haven't said much about yet, and will in a minute. And of course, there's Stalin over on the left, looking Napoleonic, with a hand in his tunic, hand in his overcoat. And the triumvirate then could be said to be Zinoviev first, Stalin second, Kamenev third, or maybe Kamenev second, Stalin third. Nobody would have said that triumvirate, the people who were starting to form up as the post-Lenin leadership, or looking very much like the post-Lenin leadership, nobody would have said that they were led by Stalin. Everybody would have said that they're led by Zinoviev. Zinoviev, the most prominent person in the party, and he's really going to have a huge impact on things from this point on. All right, but at the end of 1923, we have the opportunity for a revolution in Germany, upon which the whole Soviet project, as we've been saying, depends. There's a huge inflation in Germany. The French invade Germany in order to try to make the Germans pay in kind, that is to say with products, rather than with this worthless money that they're turning out, obviously with an idea of subverting the reparations regime. And what results from this French leadership is a big nationalist effort to destroy the currency entirely, which is what the Germans do. And then there's a revolt against that that takes place at the end of the year 1923, a revolt against that. And this is the Hamburg, this is a poster from the Hamburg revolt that took place when the German communists decided to try to take power in October of 1923. The prominent woman on the left is Larissa Reisner. She was closely associated with the Hamburg communists, although she's a member of the Russian party and the sometime lover of Karl Radek, the wife of Raskolnikov, the ambassador to Afghanistan. So a little bit of a complicated personal arrangement there, which we haven't got time to go into. Of course, if we were writing novels about this. This would be great stuff, the great stuff for a novel. But that, of course, isn't our task. At any rate, at the end of 1923, the German Revolution comes up very sharply. And also there's a crisis with the revolution, with the workers in Russia as well. So a kind of dual crisis. The party feels it's in difficult straits. And then to top it all off, Lenin dies on them in January of 1924. So here is a painting of Lenin's funeral, Lenin lying in state. And eventually they're going to mummify Lenin and put him in the Lenin mausoleum. And everybody's going to come and visit something that looks like him. Down to our day, people still do this. They have not decided to bury Lenin even yet. That's not something Lenin would have done, nor is it something Trotsky would have done. But it is the kind of thing that happened in Stalin's Russia, and that was really something that the Russians have always wondered about. And they will probably continue to debate this. They don't exactly know what to do about the corpse of Lenin, even the remains of Lenin, I should say, even to this day. But Lenin is gone now. It's a question of who's going to succeed Lenin. We should look back to this period, 1922, just before Lenin's death, when Lenin is fighting against Stalin and the Triumvirate, fighting them tooth and nail with Trotsky as his ally. It's during this period that Lenin dictated what's become known as the Testament. It's an evaluation of all the leaders. I used to read out the whole Testament line by line. We would analyze it all, but perhaps we can pass by this time and just get down to the essentials about the Testament. What's really important about the Testament is that it expresses reservations about all the leaders, about Trotsky, about Lenin. It turns out that both Lenin and Trotsky, or I should say both Trotsky and Stalin, are criticized by Lenin in the Testament for having too much of an enthusiasm for the administrative side of the work, meaning they're not political enough, meaning they don't try to educate and convince colleagues, meaning they're good at applying pressure, meaning they love to give orders, that sort of thing. So Lenin talking in those terms about all of them, but not of course condemning them for that, but just saying that these are shortcomings with these people. He speaks very poorly about Buharin. He says that Buharin's not, you can't even decide if Buharin's really a Marxist. That's quite a thing to say about a Soviet leader. but a terrible, terrible criticism of Buharin, but not a condemnation. And at the end of this testament, this evaluation of leaders, Lenin ends up saying, oh, I think that all the comrades can probably improve themselves by, taking action to remove these deficiencies and all the rest of it. But then there's an addendum to the testament, so-called, added just a few days later. This is in December of 1922, in which Lenin says about Stalin that he thinks that it's, in view of all the things that he's written about the other comrades, that Stalin is particularly dangerous, and that the leaders of the party ought to get together and remove Stalin from his post as general secretary. His qualities are fine, and they're perfectly okay among us communists, but in a general secretary, maybe they're not the best. And this post may become more important in the future, etc. And before that happens, we need to remove Stalin from the leaders. So that's the important thing that Trotsky and a number of others got from this thing, that the testament says that Lenin's got to be removed. So we have a little background noise here. Don't be bothered by this noise. Okay, so that is the Lenin testament, the failure of the German Revolution, the death of Lenin, and then come the postmortems about the German Revolution. And these have to do with one of the most brilliant of the German communists, Ruth Fischer, who's involved in a fairly tangled quarrel inside the leadership of the German party, which I don't think we need to pause in, although it's fascinating, of course. We like to read or write novels about that as well, but we haven't got time to really go into the innards of the German party leadership dispute, except to say that Ruth Fischer is pretty much set against all the leadership. They failed in 1923, and she wants to blame them for the failure, and she wants to use it as a springboard for her getting the leadership of the party. That sort of figures. When others have failed, you say you can provide better leadership. She's the close confrère of Zinoviev in the Russian party. So in her postmortems, she offers the view that Trotskyism is taking hold in the German party, that her opponents in Germany are Trotskyites, and that in Russia, there's Trotskyism as well, and that it's not Leninism. And that those who oppose Trotsky can do it in the name of Leninism. This particularly pernicious interpretation of Trotsky, Lenin, Stalin, all the other leaders, this particularly odd construction, this ideological, how would you say, ideological sharp practice on the part of Ruth Fischer. I would call it the big lie of the Russian Revolution. The idea that somehow there's such a thing as Leninism, or as she and Zinoviev like to put it, Marxism-Leninism. The idea that there is such a thing as Leninism, which is the opposite of Trotskyism. This is right in the leadership of the Bolshevik Party, bear in mind. And that it says, in effect, that everything Trotsky has represented in the party, everything he's done in the party, has all been some kind of heresy, some kind of awful thing that has to be rooted out, it has to be fought against politically, and even has to have an ism attached to it, Trotskyism. Not just enough to talk about Trotskyists, Trotsky, say Trotskyites, and you have to talk about them as if they have betrayed the revolution. All this cooked up in Ruth Fischer's mind, as brilliant as she was, and Machiavellian as she was. This, I think, has to be considered the big lie, or at any rate, I would consider it that, the big lie of the Russian Revolution, the thing that they carry with them today, this idea of the devil Trotsky and all the awful things that Trotsky represents. And of course, once you say that, you're going to say the opposite of that is Leninist, not Lenin, but Leninist. Lenin would never have had an ism associated with his name. The idea came up a couple of times, and he laughingly rejected it during his lifetime. But once he's gone, of course, you can arrange this cult of Lenin. And on the basis of this cult of Lenin, of course, Stalin is going to be the main beneficiary, but its author, or I should say its authoress, is Ruth Fischer. And Ruth Fischer and Zinoviev are the ones who are responsible for using the myth of Trotsky and Trotskyism, Lenin and Leninism, those two being opposed. They're the people who use this myth in order to attempt to get power. She, of course, to get control over the German party, Zinoviev to get control over the Russian party. And in the course of that, they made the decision that Trotsky, of course, was the enemy. He was a Bonaparte. There he is looking like a Bonaparte in his military uniform. Remember, he's Commissar of War at this time. Trotsky represents something really awful in the party, and he's got to renounce Trotskyism, which actually Trotsky's going to do. He steps down from his post as War Commissar, and he renounces Trotskyism. He says, I, Trotsky, stand on Leninism. But that, by the way, is what any Trotskyist that you run into nowadays will tell you. That is what Trotskyism means. It means the true Leninism. But in fact, I think it means what Zinoviev and Ruth Fischer cooked up against Trotsky in 1924. So I have no hesitation in calling it the big lie of the Russian Revolution. Well, in the name of the big lie of the Russian Revolution, Zinoviev will get to change all the leadership of all the communist parties. Stalin, in return, will get to bring 250,000 new people into the Communist Party of Russia, whose dossiers he will have, people who will be selected carefully, and people who are going to be, for the most part, supporters of Stalin through thick and thin, no matter what Stalin does from this point on. He calls this a Lenin levy. That's the buildup of the apparatus. That's the bargain that Zinoviev and Stalin struck in order to banish Trotskyism. They are not strong enough to banish Trotsky himself. So Trotsky stays in the leadership, but he steps down, and he's going to become a lot less important from this point on. So who's going to become more important from this point on? Of all people, it's going to be Nikolai Buharin, seen here on the right with Stalin. So Buharin now comes to the fore, starts to criticize some of the excesses of Zinoviev, starts to indicate that really the person who really lost in Germany was Zinoviev rather than anybody else. After all, Zinoviev is head of the Comintern, so he really does bear, in a certain sense, the administrative responsibility for having lost in Germany, if there was ever really a chance of winning in Germany. And Buharin starts to make a more general argument to the effect that we've been too left in the past. We have to turn to the right. We have to be much more, how to put it, much more conservative as leaders in the. So Bolshevism gets a right wing on account of Buharin. In fact, Buharin says the NEP, the relationship with the peasant, it has to be smoothed over. And the peasants, insofar as they anybody asks him how they can contribute to the revolution, he uses the phrase of Guizot, the French politician from the 19th century, when Guizot was asked what a Frenchman can do for his country, to help his country. Guizot answered, enrichez-vous, enrich yourself. And Buharin gives the same advice to the Russian peasant. Enrichez-vous, he says, to the Russian peasant. So he's a man who defends NEP, defends the capitalist peasant, thinks the regime ought to just calm down, more or less continues in the vein of Sokolnikov in 1922, a guy the British are bound to like, and he wants to have better relations with the British. He and his friend Rykov are going to form the Anglo-Soviet Trade Union Committee, and his concept is that the workers in Britain are going to be the friend of the Bolsheviks. They're going to prevent the British leaders from causing any difficulty for the Bolsheviks. So it's a kind of a play, in effect. This thought is a kind of a play for the help, so to speak, or for reliance, you could say, reliance on the help of the British workers. And they think so much of this that they offer the slogan, socialism in one country, a slogan which is usually associated with Stalin, but was really originated by Buharin. And two of them began to argue for it at about the same time in 1925. So socialism in one country. Socialism in one country. Here's the Stalin-Buharin combination. There's more Stalin-Buharin, a grouping of communists around them. You see them right in the middle. There's a picture of Buharin, two others. Socialism in One Country is the title of a series of books that E.H. Carr, the British historian, put out. And socialism in one country has always been thought of in the West as a kind of a practical course of the Russians to give up on the world revolution. Think of what that means for the British. It means give up challenging the British Empire in India and China and various other places. It means things more or less on the quiet from this point. So you can see there's an attempt and a certain, how to put it, a certain enthusiasm on the part of British readers to see something that they can live with in the idea of socialism in one country. Socialism in one country is, of course, always opposed to the idea of Bolshevism as a revolutionary international conception. So these things are a little bit overblown and kind of exaggerated, a little more mythical than they might seem. But these are those slogans under which Stalin and Buharin were marching at the time. And what it says, in effect, is that Russia doesn't need to have a German revolution come to its aid, that the moral support of the proletariat in the West, what they mean by that is the support of the British trade union leaders preventing their government from anti-Soviet action, that this is going to allow the Soviets to get by. So the great historian of this is Steve Cohn. You may know him. He's one of the few people who sticks up for Putin's Russia today. He's not the only one, but he's one of the few. And wrote a celebrated biography of Buharin, which absolutely captivated, or at least Gorbachev says it captivated him, Gorbachev, in the 1980s. It may have had something to do with the reform course that Gorbachev chose in the 1980s, about which we'll speak at the end of the course. Against the right and the party, the Stalin-Buharin bloc, there emerged in 1926 a bloc of Zinoviev, pretty much pushed out into the cold by Stalin's move in the direction of Buharin. Zinoviev, who you see slightly to your right of center in this, you can recognize him. And then Trotsky slightly left of center in this picture. Zinoviev and Trotsky, a joint opposition. So there's a meeting of the joint opposition called Radek up in the top row. And the position of the joint opposition is that the Zinoviev, that the Stalin-Buharin leadership of the party is running the party aground and is losing all over the place. So they take the view that there has to be a socialist offensive inside the NEP. They're not calling for a 5-year plan, but something close to it. A socialist offensive, meaning heavy industry needs to be stressed more and built more, and the peasant needs to pay for it. So they do argue in that direction, but they don't argue anything so extreme as to say we need to collectivize agriculture and adopt a planned economy, as Stalin will do. But they're on the way to doing something just like that. And they say socialism in one country means giving up on the revolutionary cause abroad. And in particular, it means giving up on all the possibilities for the revolution that are coming up abroad. And in particular, they're thinking about England and China. Well, I don't know that they had possibility for a revolution in England, but they thought they might have, or at any rate, they thought the Communist Party in England might take a step forward in the British working class. And the occasion for that hope was the British general strike that occurred in 1926, starting out with a mine dispute over pay, in which the whole TUC, the Trade Union Congress, joined in support, and they're against the government. And so here's the way the Punch saw the matter. John Bull there is being challenged fundamentally. It's a question of who runs Britain. He's practically saying this is a revolutionary movement by the British trade union leaders. They, of course, would deny this down to the details. They would deny this. And it's an accusation, however, that's thrown at them that they're really revolutionaries. They're kind of friendly to the Bolsheviks, trying to overthrow Britain. It's a fundamental question. It's either they win or Britain wins. And this is a view that the British press took. There's another, I believe this is Bernard Partridge. No, it's not Partridge. Yes, it is Bernard Partridge. Yeah, he did a lot of these. Here's John Bull looking at a British worker forging a weapon at the anvil. And the worker says it's to protect us all. And John Bull is saying, in effect, well, I hope it's not your weapon to use against me. So you see this perspective coming forward very sharply in 1926, mainly among the conservatives, mainly among the right wing of the Conservative Party led by Lord Birkenhead, Sir William Joynson Hicks, Winston Churchill, and a number of others were saying that this Anglo-Soviet trade treaty is a bad idea. Look at the subversion it's creating in our English working class movement. So there's a fundamental threat, they think, being posed from within. And there's a secondary threat in China. They say the Bolsheviks are active in China, perfectly right, by the way. The Bolsheviks are active in China, that they're encouraging left-wingers in China, especially the nationalists and the Kuomintang in China, and that these are trying to overthrow the British rule over the treaty ports and over those ports, their treaty ports as well, in the Yangtze Basin. The treaty ports on the ocean and treaty ports in the Yangtze Basin. That's a British sphere of influence. There you see it on this map, shown in green. Treaty ports on the coast and treaty ports up the Yangtze River, as far as Wuhan and Hankow, the cities that are right across each other on the river. And here's a just for our reference, rough reference. Here's a map that shows China's outlines and the spheres of influence. I say ambitions of the foreign powers in China. And at the top, you see, of course, the Russian sphere of influence, and Soviets are continuing in the same vein. They too would like to have influence over these areas. And then you see the British, and it's also indicated on this map they have an interest in Tibet, but I doubt very many British made their way through Tibet during these years to establish anything much. Same way with Nepal and Bhutan. That goes without saying, I guess. But the French in the south as well. As long as the British succeed, the French will succeed, but not on their own, not on the with the French on their own. And then this shows a German sphere of influence, which no longer applies at this point. We have Japan, in effect, which wants to be the top dog, basically, in China. And it's going to support warlords in the north of China. At the same time, in 1926, the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalists, started out from Canton at the bottom of this map. Canton, in a great northern march, they called it, up to Beijing, the capital, not really a capital that ran the country, but a capital nonetheless, capture the capital and unite China for the first time. So that's the path that they traveled. And through each of these provinces, they try to win over the warlords for communism. And some of these warlords, they came along and actually try to take power. So the Bolsheviks, in general, are supporting this movement of the Chinese nationalists, which is hostile to the British. So add this to the British general strike, and you get an idea of how excited the British were getting about the threat from international communism, from the Soviet Union, and from the pernicious Anglo-Soviet trade treaty. And so here's General Wu Peifu, who's the warlord in charge in Beijing. There's Zhang Zolin, that's the Japanese puppet for the most part in Manchuria. And there's Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Kuomintang, Chinese nationalists, and getting mainly his support from the Soviets. But now the British want to try to see if they can buy Chiang Kai-shek, become the main supporter of Chiang Kai-shek, urge his anti-communism to come to the fore and see if they can get him to turn against the rest of the leadership. And this turns out to be perfectly right. The British conducted an agreement with him. They gave the Kuomintang control over a British treaty port, Hankow, right across the river from Wuhan. They gave it to the Kuomintang. First time the British have ever yielded any kind of colonial piece of territory of any importance. They give it to the Kuomintang, and in return, Chiang Kai-shek eventually turns against the communists and carries out a series of frightful massacres, of course elevating himself to the position of maybe the most important warlord, a nationalist warlord, you could call him. We'll talk more about his problems and the Soviet problems in China as we proceed. Mao Zedong is just a thought at this point, not really a major leader in the party. He's going to be as soon as Chiang Kai-shek crushes the party completely. Mao Zedong will pick up the pieces and will go out into the countryside and fight in the 30s. We'll talk more about him when we get there. But in the meantime, Chiang Kai-shek is carrying out this terrific pogrom against the Chinese communists in the Chinese cities in Shanghai. Here they are with an English-speaking series of English banners proclaiming the Chinese revolution. But these are going to be crushed by Chiang Kai-shek and brutally in front of the whole world. A whole series of ghastly massacres, the worst one being in Shanghai, where thousands of communists are just picked out and shot in the streets in front of everyone. Terrible, terrible defeat for the communists, crushing, in effect, the communist movement. But it's not so bad, strictly speaking, for the British. But at this point, we find that the British, especially the right wing of the Conservative Party, the people around Lord Birkenhead and Sir William Joynson Hicks, Winston Churchill, people like that. Here we have Sir Edwin Montagu walking along beside Sir William Joynson Hicks, the Home Secretary. Sir William Joynson Hicks takes a view that the Lloyd George regime made a terrible mistake playing ball with the communists, conducting trade with the communists, hoping the communists would leave India alone and all the rest of it. That what he is getting instead is an international movement to overthrow the existing cosmos, as Sir William Joynson Hicks put it in a very colorful phrase. Overthrow the existing cosmos, he said. And they demand, Churchill demands a counteroffensive to crush communism, to turn against it, fight against it with every weapon at their disposal, to break this Anglo-Soviet trade treaty, and to encourage anybody who wants to fight communism to do so. Remember, Churchill has also been weighing this idea that when you say Bolshevism, you're really saying Zionism, that there really is such a thing. This comes from an article that Churchill wrote in 1920, which says more or less, well, it's not more or less, he says that Bolshevism is a product of the Jewish people, that there is such a thing as Jewish Bolshevism. We're used to associating this idea with Adolf Hitler, of course, and with others of the anti-Semites and right-wingers in Eastern Europe. But actually, Churchill is on board with this notion in 1920. And of course, he says it's a struggle for the soul of the Jewish people. He's talking about Zionism on the other side. The Jews have given us Bolshevism. They're leading Bolshevism against the world. The only hope the world has is if the Zionists somehow get control of Bolshevism. I guess the reason that the Zionists should get control of Bolshevism is so that they can get a piece of land that they can live on in the world. So bizarre ideas that Winston Churchill has been cottoning with since 1920. And I don't think he has really entirely abandoned them at the time of this so-called die-hard revolt, die-hard counteroffensive, they called it at the time, against Bolshevism. It's a big scare for the Soviets, a big scare, of course, for everybody, but a big scare for the Soviets because they really feel that the British are now going to encourage maybe Poland or maybe Japan, or who knows, maybe Kuomintang, China under Chiang Kai-shek, to revisit the Allied intervention, which is not too old, is it? It's not even 10 years old by this time. To have another chapter of the Allied intervention in Russia, which maybe they could have done. I mean, at any rate, the Bolsheviks certainly thought they might have been able to do it. And you see that their party dispute, which is reaching a height at this point, now starts to have this as a backdrop, discussing this war scare, this possibility that they're going to be doing war with Poland on the one hand and with Japan or China in the east on the other. And so here is the famous liberal cartoonist's version of this matter about how everybody is seeing red, and that seeing red really shows you the Russians are red, and maybe the working class, maybe our own British working class is red, and certainly the Chinese, they're all red. There's a tremendous problem with the Chinese, and who knows, lots of other people in the colonies, maybe they're red, and everybody's red. And of course, Lowe is thinking in terms of Lloyd George's famous statement, seeing red may be worse than actually being red. So a comment on the anti-communism of the diehards in 1927, which is so frightening to the Soviets. The result of that was a war scare in the Soviet Union. The peasants got wind of this possibility of war and started to hoard grain. And the regime is now up against it in Russia. As a result of the war scare, they're starting to think there may be another Allied intervention. Who knows, their whole regime under the NEP may be ready to collapse from without, presumably, or maybe because of a big revolt of the peasantry. They've got to take some kind of stern measures in the spirit, I think, of war communism. And this is where Stalin has his great opportunity. He's going to be the great figure that under the aegis of war communism brings into being the collectivization of agriculture and the first 5-year plan to mobilize Russian industry. So here we have the external influence of the revolutionary impact of Soviet Russia on the world and the world's reaction to the Soviet Union, causing a crisis inside the Soviet Union is going to change the Soviet Union fundamentally. So along with the other explanations about why Lenin and his regime turned into Stalin and his regime, we ought to we have to consider this thought. How is it going to happen in 1927? How are the Russians going to respond? What is Stalin going to do? So let's talk about that. Let's talk about that next time.